Hi, thanks so much, Tom. Thanks, Chair Borden. Thanks to the MTA board. Um, Want to just say what a pleasure it is to be with you all. I'm having so many memories of being on the board, both there sitting with you all on the board seats, but also advocating from the other side, which is our other end of the room. It's really exciting to be with you. And I just want to say, big kudos to San Francisco. I was also really honored to be part of that effort in 2014. And it still surprises me in some ways how quickly, frankly, and enthusiastically we had support from MTA director, police chief, public health director, Mayor Leah at the time, and the MTA board and board of supervisors. I know there's strong commitment to this goal of Vision Zero in San Francisco, and you all have been strong leaders throughout. And I'd say now's the chance to really gear it up to the next level. So I'm going to share some slides now if I can. Let me do this and hope that it works. Here we go. Just give me a second if you would. And it's not that. One more second. Okay. Great. Okay. Can you tell me if you're seeing my slide okay now?
Yes, and I'll ask other members of the board to go off of camera so that the slide presentation is what's prominent for everyone.
Okay, thank you so much. Great. So just a little bit about who we are at the Vision Zero Network. We're a nonprofit group. I'm still based in San Francisco and working on Vision Zero, but across the nation. So I really want to share with you what we're seeing in other places and hopefully to learn from that. And what the Vision Zero Network is doing as a nonprofit is really helping promote and explain Vision Zero. What is it? How does it differ from the traditional approach? And what are we really learning? Because as we know, we really are learning. We're adopting some things from other countries, but also needing to make it right size for our American culture. So what I'm going to talk about today are three areas of the status of Vision Zero kind of broadly in the US, how I think San Francisco is measuring up, and then really looking at a path forward for San Francisco and I'd say additionally other early adopting cities. And I really want to emphasize what we're going to be talking about, I think, overall is how is Vision Zero shifting the paradigm and giving some concrete examples of that. And really excited to hear from Ryan and your MTA team, who's fantastic, and then to hear the board discussion. So I always like to start with this image. I won't go through everything here. I'm guessing folks are a little bit familiar with this, but I think it's really important to emphasize to anyone who may be new to this or listening and such, Vision Zero is not a tagline. It's not a PR campaign. It's not even a program. You know, one could say, oh, we started a new program in the year 2014. It's not even that. Vision Zero really is, to be effective, to be successful, it is a paradigm shift. And we'll talk about that, but it's a really different way of thinking. So just to name a few here, the idea that traffic deaths are inevitable to the idea that traffic deaths are preventable. And as Tom McGuire said, you all set in 2014 an ambitious and I would call very appropriate and ethically correct goal of zero traffic deaths. Well, that's a really different way of thinking. So that approach, not only is that number and that goal significant, but what we've learned from other places is when you set that very ambitious and very clear goal, you do things differently. So it's not just a talking point. Again, not just a PR campaign. It's not just a catchy name. It is actually a shift in how work is done. So we really want to talk about that. So I want to share this map. This is pretty amazing because, gosh, when I was way back with the San Francisco Bicycle Coalition so many years ago, there were only two dots on this map. One was New York City, as mentioned, the first US city to commit to Vision Zero. And the second was San Francisco. So cheers to us. Thank you for your leadership and many, many folks who've put this work in. So pretty amazing. This is what you're looking at now on the map is more than 40 US communities that have committed to Vision Zero. So, you know, you've got your biggies like Chicago and Portland and Austin, but you've got a lot of smaller communities and maybe what we'd call not so usual suspects, Laredo, Texas, Macon, Georgia, Orlando, Florida. And it's really exciting to see this interest and commitment to Vision Zero growing. I just want to pause here for a second. We don't have time to talk about all the things y'all are, you know, I think doing well and have really been leaders on, but I want to point out a couple because I talk about these a lot in my work with other cities. And just as a reminder, we are a network. We're working with all these communities. We're trying to help people learn from each other. None of us is perfect. None of us knows all the answers. But the truth is, Anchorage can learn from Eugene, and Boulder can learn from Charlotte, and we can learn from Philly. We can all learn from each other. So I want to name a couple things I'm really, really thankful to San Francisco for leading on from the very beginning, and that I commend you guys a lot on lots of our webinars and talks. So one is really being the leader on having a public health and transportation partnership. Really glad public health is here today. And to mention that I think a lot of the success and progress and reframing of traffic safety that you all have been able to do has been in large part because you're recognizing this is not just a transportation issue. This is a public health issue and really a social justice issue we'll talk more about. And you're doing that better than any other city I'm seeing in the country. So that strong public health transportation partnership is huge, and leadership. Related to that, I think, is your strong success and leadership on the high injury network. So taking that data-driven approach. It might sound like old hat to us now, but you guys were really the first to do that. And it's pretty amazing to me that not all cities have done it always, but they haven't, but more and more are. And we really show them your work as an example. The next I would say is really your strong equity focus. And I think that, again, importantly is helped from that public health and data-driven approach. So I know, having the epidemiology tied to it really helps show how is this an intersectional issue. We might wish we were just working on transportation, but we're not. It's tied to everything else, so many other things, of course, access to jobs, et cetera, et cetera. And then I think really having the political and community engagement, which you've had. So these are all things that I want to commend San Francisco for and say, keep at it. And there's a lot of ways that you guys have been such strong leaders. I want to share that it's not just those cities I pointed out committing to Vision Zero. It's also to some degree, I'm going to kind of couch my words here a bit, to some degree at the federal level. Certainly not as much as I wish or as strongly as I wish, but a lot more than it used to be. This is just an image from a report called the Road to Zero report from a coalition called the Road to Zero Coalition that really was started by the U.S. Department of Transportation, now run by the National Safety Council. If you haven't seen it, this is a really tremendous report. It sets the goal and lays out plans, I wouldn't say plans, but high-level strategies that you'll see here, these 4 strategies for reaching zero traffic deaths nationwide by 2050. They don't get into detail I wish they did. They certainly don't put the money behind it yet, but this is a really big step. And I want to tell you this, we hear directly, I'm on a group here that helps with this national work. The folks at the national level are looking at the cities for what's next. And that maybe doesn't surprise you so much, but this is really percolating up. So what you're doing, what Seattle, New York, LA, Austin, what we're doing at the local level is really, really bubbling up. I'm happy to share more examples of that, but I won't get into it too much now. Okay, so that's the positive part. There's some negative here too. And by negative, it's not a big surprise, but I want to share this statistic. Hopefully you're seeing, this was an analysis done by City Lab Media in November 2019, so about a year old. And what you'll see here is 5 cities charted and their traffic fatality rates. So not numbers, but rates. And as you all know, San Francisco was trending down, meaning fewer deaths, which is fantastic. And then unfortunately has been trending back up. So not dissimilar to New York. We'll talk more about New York. But unfortunately, in some of these other cities, we're seeing a real more significant rise. This doesn't show all the Vision Zero cities, of course. That's not everything. But I think this is an important place to really say, okay, why is this happening? Well, anybody who's in this, first of all, I want to say they didn't all start at the same time either. LA, DC, Chicago started later than us, and New York, which was 2014. So this is a little bit misleading. But in the big picture, what I want to kind of point out here is, should we be troubled that we're not doing better? Sure, yes, we should be, because we want safety for everyone. Does it mean that Vision Zero is not working? No, it doesn't. And I want to talk a lot about that. But when one makes a commitment, verbally, or even creating a plan, nothing changes on day one, right? It takes a lot of time, hopefully not too much time, but some time, and a lot of change. And this is where the paradigm shift comes in. But simply by making a commitment in words and writing up a plan didn't change anything. Just put something down on paper, right? Now we need to be doing the change. And I want to talk. I know San Francisco is doing a lot of it. New York's doing a lot of it. These other cities are doing a lot of it, but we're not yet hitting those really big transformative changes yet. And frankly, we haven't had enough time to see the change. I also want to kind of maybe soften that blow of, hey, we're not all trending perfectly down, with the reality that we're up against some really big and I would say pretty tough trends here nationally. Folks probably know that last year, the last number we have full numbers for, last year there were about a little over 36,000 traffic deaths in the US. That's 100 people every day in the country. And, just unacceptable, a huge number of traffic deaths. And Vision Zero cities are generally doing, in terms of rates, better than the national rates. Now, let me say, we were doing better before. A lot of that, of course, this is not just, abracadabra with your magic wand about Vision Zero. It's also, of course, about land use and transit and all of these important things and density and such. So I just want to put in context, though, that we've been trending badly overall nationally. And I really want to call out the pedestrian safety numbers. I'm sure you all are familiar with these. This is sourced from the Governor's Highway Safety Association, but just tremendously bad. I mean, what we're seeing is that last year's traffic pedestrian deaths was the highest in 30 years in the US. So just terribly traumatic numbers. And I want to share one other stat that I just learned. This was a study recently published in a publication called Health Affairs, Public Health Agency or group. They compared child mortality rates in the 20 wealthy democratic nations, so similar nations in terms of economies and such, 20 wealthy democratic nations. US kids' health fared worst, the worst of all 20 of those nations. Specifically, around traffic fatalities, American kids were twice as likely to die in traffic fatalities compared overall with the other wealthy nations. So this is significant. And again, I know I'm getting a little dire and dark here for a second more on the national kind of situation. You all know this is, I could fill the slide with many more things, but we know that our federal transportation policies, and I would contend sometimes even some of the state policies are obstacles for us and for other cities. We know that unfortunately the pandemic has made fewer trips, but more speeding. So I'm thinking about 2020 being particularly worrisome. And then the link in rise of SUVs related to pedestrian safety. There was an 81% increase in pedestrian deaths, people hit by SUVs between the years 2009 and 2016, according to the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety. I say some of these and I point to the state and federal, not to say we're off the hook, because we're not, because death is death and danger is danger. We've got to be thinking, and we are thinking, and I want to encourage us on this call to think, how are we influencing those state and federal policies and such that need to change? But we certainly need to be engaging there. And then one really important, I think, kind of opener here, or just setting the stage, is that data-driven work around Vision Zero. Again, we're much more data-driven than we used to be around this work. And again, thank you, San Francisco, for leading that with your high injury network work and having an eye to equity and health equity in particular. And in this time of much greater awareness nationally and in the city, but nationally around racial injustices, we can't deny these numbers, or we really need to think about, and we are thinking about, how are people in low-income communities disproportionately impacted by traffic violence? How are people in African-American, Latino communities of color disproportionately impacted? So we know that this all relates back to the work we're doing. And again, I want to really emphasize right away the equity piece, that we know we can't educate or enforce our way out of these problems. And I don't think San Francisco is trying to do that. I think you guys have always understood this needs to be, the greatest emphasis needs to be on the built environment. And I think we'll see here that we need to really double down on the built environment, and if anything, be shifting our approach on the enforcement and education pieces. Regarding enforcement specifically, just practically speaking, we all know there are not enough police, and there never will be, to be out on every corner. There's also big questions about the effectiveness, but I'd say perhaps most urgently right now, we wouldn't want police officers on every corner, right? Given the concerns about racial bias and inequities and injustice in many, many systems, not just traffic safety, but including in traffic safety, we've got to figure out, and we've got to double down on building self-enforcing roadways, and changing our situations to encourage safe behavior. We can't depend on enforcement and education to do that. So this is probably kind of what I'm guessing a lot of folks are really interested on this call. So switching to how is San Francisco measuring up? And we're going to kind of come back to this at the end, but I would very simply put it this way, and this is certainly simplifying, but kind of got the traditional approach. And when I say traditional approach, it's the traditional E's, right? Engineering, education, enforcement, emergency medical services. We've been evaluation. I would certainly add evaluation. We've been pushing, and others have, for equity and engagement in here too, which is important. All those E's are important, but those E's are not created equal. And part of what Vision Zero does is really, frankly, be more direct and honest about reordering the E's. And like I was just saying, greater emphasis, and I would say political will and resources need to go to the built environment and to the speed policies, and really rethinking about how enforcement and education fit there. So you'll see where I have San Francisco of, we are certainly, I will absolutely give the city of San Francisco credit. We are leading in that space of Vision Zero cities. I would say it's San Francisco, New York, Portland, Seattle, and some others doing great work, and many doing great work. I'd say a lot of them are just at the early stages though, they're just newer. So us, San Francisco, being an early adopter, obviously we're further along and we're getting a lot done. Yet, as you can see kind of from my plan or spectrum here, we're not where we need to be. So how do we get there? And I'm going to start by talking about New York. And that might be annoying to some people because I know some people say, oh, nothing is like New York and New York's so different. Absolutely, but there's a lot we can learn. And I know, you guys certainly have good connections there and know a lot about this, but I think I really want to emphasize it to show what's possible. And I think where San Francisco and many cities should be going next. So why am I talking about New York? First of all, they are the longest running Vision Zero city, just a little bit ahead of us in terms of US, again, in terms of US cities. And in their first years of Vision Zero, again, they adopted in 2014, but we're looking at 2013 numbers. So just to be clear, 2013 was their final year, let's say, before Vision Zero or BVZ, and then looking at 2019 from last year. So these numbers are pretty impressive overall, obviously. Traffic deaths down citywide, 26%. Pedestrian deaths down, 33%. That's pretty amazing. We're talking about a city of over 8 million people and over 6,000 miles of roadway. This is significant. I do want to note, I know they ticked up, as you can see on the numbers there, they did unfortunately tick. It was a better downward trend, as you see, but it ticked back up in 2019 and unfortunately is similar in 2020. Though notably, any death is too many, of course, but those numbers, even though they ticked up in 2019 and likely 2020, those numbers are still significantly lower than pre-Vision Zero. So really notable. So how did they do that? I'm going to just hit some highlights. I know folks on your staff know maybe more about this and can share, but I'm just going to share a couple quick stats. So in 2019 alone, well, actually, before I do that, let me say with what they started with. When they kicked off in 2014, their biggest priorities, and they did a lot of things, I'm not going to name them all, but the area they focused the most political and agency and advocacy energy in early on was managing speed for safety. So number one, they lowered speeds. They lowered their actual speed limit. It wasn't easy. They had to go to their state and fight for it. You'll see that little picture in the top left. They did have a 30 mile per hour citywide speed limit, and they had to go, and they needed to go to the state. It wasn't easy, but they did it, and they lobbied to be able to bring that down citywide to 25 miles per hour. They then did a major campaign and really raised awareness about what the speed limit is and why it matters. And then secondly, I'm sure folks know, they now have a robust automated speed enforcement program or safety cameras. That also started in 2014. They started with just 140 locations. Well, that sounds like a lot, doesn't it? 140 locations around school zones. This was limited to school zones. But in those early days, that first phase, let's call it, of those locations, they saw a 60% decrease in median speeds in those areas. So really significant. Because that was so successful and so effective, they've since gone back, again, had to lobby at the state level and gotten approval to expand their program, still school zone only, which is, I think, frustrating to them, they say, but school zone only now, 750 school zones. So really significant. And I really want to emphasize that they were also doing many, many other things we'll talk about, but the speed was the most important piece. And even though that was a big lift at the state level, they did it. Here, now I'm going to just quickly read, this is worth noting too. In that similar time frame between 2013 and 2018, bike ridership increased 53% across New York City. And I'm going to share now just a quick list of things they did just in 2019. I think this is important to note. Granted, that was pre-COVID, but so 2019 would have been what, their year 5 or 6? I'm doing my math there. And here's a quick list. They added 975 leading pedestrian intervals. They added 21 miles of protected bike lanes, new ones. They did retiming. They retimed traffic signal lights on 120 miles. They traffic calmed 79 locations, specifically with their left turn traffic calming treatment, which I'll come back to. I mentioned the cameras. And I want to mention one other one that's really important. You look on the bottom right, it's 14th Street. And people may be familiar with 14th Street in Manhattan. If not, check it out. I was not before this, but it is an important busway. And it's a busway where buses were getting caught in the congestion. And it was a mess, as I understand, and not good for pedestrians, not good for a huge number of people on transit, et cetera. So last year, just over a year ago, and I want to note with relatively, I don't want to say little, but without a long drawn out process, they voted to and decided to make 14th Street busway only. So it's buses, some various trucks, but not regular private vehicles. And what they've seen just in this year on that street, bus ridership is up 24%. The crosstown bus commutes of these lines, so those running on 14th Street, their crosstown commute is down about 10 minutes. And notably, trips for other vehicles. So let's say, where did the cars go, right? There used to be private cars on here. Where did they go? Well, they went to parallel streets, other streets. The time increases, or travel time on these other streets, were less than a minute longer. So tremendous success. And I will just pause here. I wouldn't be wearing my good San Francisco resident hat if I didn't say how worrisome it is to hear Market Street being delayed again after 20 years, at least 20 years. And gosh, I'd love to find out how New York moved on 14th Street so quickly. I know it's a smaller, simpler project, but it's a great example of scale, I think, and how we need to be thinking at faster scale as they are. I also want to pause here and give a little example on New York City's. I mentioned that left turn calming treatment. I think this is something y'all are doing in San Francisco on a smaller scale. I hope it's something that looks productive and you'll gear up. I want to mention this because I think it's a really important, it's not just a project. And I think it's important here to mention Vision Zero doesn't bring a new toolbox. Nothing I'm talking about here is a new trick, right? It's not a brand new silver bullet for fixing things. Really what it's about is frankly, having stronger public urging, political commitment and will, faster turnaround, willingness to try things, all things that y'all are doing and about, but even scaled up more. So I'm mentioning this one. You'll see a little schematic here around left turns. Early in their work, New York City was really wise, I think, in saying, hey, we can't constantly be chasing the crash that happened yesterday, or the death or the severe injury that happened yesterday or over the last 5 years. Yes, you do need to do that. You start with where your known problems are. But what we really want to see is, what are the trends showing us? And what they saw is that they identified that left turns, and a certain kind of left turn, I'm not going to be able to describe it perfectly, but there's a whole report I'm happy to share with folks. But basically, that left turns of a certain kind were 3 times as likely as right turns to cause serious injuries and deaths, et cetera, and certain kinds. So what they did, instead of saying, hey, let's go fix those X number of problematic left turn areas where someone's been hit or injured, let's not just go do those. Let's proactively, in a forward-looking, proactive way, say, hey, if these, 20 locations have been very problematic, and we have another 100 locations that have that same general design and usage, there's pretty good reason to believe those other 100 are going to have problems at some point too, right? So they proactively identified all the intersections or areas that had this similar kind of movement. And they proactively addressed 200, a little more than 200 locations. So here you can see, for instance, they widened their turning radius for the car. It's just paint and post, no biggie there, right? Maybe they did a higher visibility crosswalk. In some of the areas where it was more, the situation was a little more dire, they would block left turns, not allow left turns. In some places, they would, if there were lights, they would time the left turn. So there's all sorts of different ways to do it. Again, the strategy isn't so different. But I want to say what they've seen where they've done this cross city. So again, across the city, not 6,000 miles of roadway, not just in a few locations, but across the city. They have seen median speeds at these types of locations, these specific locations, decrease by 24%. Huge number, because we know it's the speed that kills. And 98% of drivers, or fewer drivers, are crossing the line, or the middle yellow line when they're turning. So not impinging on that other side. So get off New York here for a second and jump ahead to say, sorry, one more thing. I won't get off New York yet. Actually, red lights. I want to mention, talked about speed enforcement cameras, but I know San Francisco was very much thinking about, and I commend you for thinking about automated enforcement. Again, not only are they far more effective than police on the street trying to enforce, but they bring a far greater sense or degree of equity, because there's not the chance for racial profiling there if the program's done well and thoughtfully placed, et cetera. But also with red light cameras. And I want to mention that New York City did a before and after analysis. This was a 3-year window of red light cameras, and where they have red light cameras, overall collisions decreased 23%, and collisions with pedestrians decreased 32%. So huge opportunity. I know San Francisco does, and California has obviously the ability to use red lights. So, huge piece that we can and should be doing more of, and then obviously thinking about automated speed enforcement. So quickly, thinking about some European locations, or international locations. I promise they won't all be European, because there is a concern about, being kind of over Eurocentric on this. But, it's really exciting to see what's happening in these other countries. London, dramatically opening up their networks to walking and biking only and transit only, dramatically limiting car space. And part of this is coming out of the pandemic. I really want to be clear about that. It's not that it was brand new, but as you'll see in that little quote there, I'm going to talk more about that report, but the responses to COVID-19 have shown potential for systemic changes to the mobility sector. And again, places like London, Paris, Brussels are really doing that and taking advantage of that. I want to mention Paris because, again, it's a city where you think, okay, maybe we can't compare ourselves to that. And yet it's a really big, complicated, kind of, messy city, and it's getting things done. Basically their post-pandemic plans, or through the pandemic, are to add 650 kilometers of bikeways citywide, and also really to make the city what's called a 15-minute city, so that they're really thinking about how do they make an ecological transformation of the city so that people can walk, bike, or take transit to most locations within a 15-minute cruise. You need the car for some trips, but those are the further trips. And really impressed the mayor there. I want to mention that Mayor Anne Hidalgo has pledged to make the city more people-friendly. One of the major ways she's doing this is to remove, believe this or not, I had to triple check this, to remove the majority of on-street car parking spaces. Apparently the plan is to go from 83,000 on-street car parking spaces to 23,000. So removing 60,000 out of 83,000. Now, as people might be rolling their eyes or gasping in shock, I want to note that Mayor Hidalgo announced this plan and these plans for the 15-minute city and all the bikeways. She announced this a bit ago. And since then, since she made all these pronouncements, she handily won re-election as mayor of Paris. So really, really showing that leadership there, which is exciting. And I want to, always do a better job. These are not just our European friends making big changes, but other places around the world. We won't get into all, but Bogota, Colombia, Mexico City, really great examples. Bogota is adding 50 miles of new dedicated bikeways on top of its 300 current. Probably heard a lot about it in terms of car-free streets every Sunday. They're doing that more and more on regular days. Mexico City, another big bustling place with a complicated system. You'll see they're lowering more and more of their speed limits, that 20-mile-per-hour street limit there, using automated speed enforcement. And I really love this quote from the Bogota plan. I'll just read the beginning. We want a city with more public space for children than for motor vehicles. It sounds so basic and compelling, right? So how do we really get there, and how do you kind of sell that? And I think, we come back to a pretty basic idea here that probably everyone agrees we want safe travel for all. And how do we move past the traditional ease, like I said? How do we move out of those silos and really think about what are the core elements of that? And I know you all do this in your action plan, your Vision Zero action plan, to really think about these areas and how much they overlap. And I'd say there's two big lessons for me that I've really learned through this work. And I truly mean, I did learn it. I didn't know this before at all. I'd say number one is let's trust the science. If there's one image or one little, I don't know, factoid or something you take away, I hope people take away from this, it is this one. And I heard somebody call this recently, really what this is showing, it's a basic, indisputable, and I know sometimes people are debating the science of things, but we won't right now, an indisputable combination of physics and biology. The human body can only withstand so much. Here's what it can withstand. This is general. For more frail elderly folks, these numbers are more extreme. For children, these numbers are more extreme. But the average person, myself being a fairly healthy middle-aged person, these are my numbers. So if we know this, if we know my chance of survival is quite good, not 100%, but good at 20 miles per hour and miserable at 40, why are we designing, setting, enforcing, or doing anything for that high end where we know there's going to be people walking and biking? Now, again, if we were all, wrapped up in a car, then no, these numbers wouldn't matter, but they matter a lot. So let's trust the science. And I would say everything we should be doing could really be based on this. And then number two, we know what works. Like I said, nothing I've shared here, and probably a lot of what you're going to hear on the San Francisco piece, it's not rocket science. It's not brand new to everyone. This is just an example for the speed piece. There's certainly more than this, but we know what works to lower speeds. We then know if we lower speeds, crashes are less frequent and less severe. And that means people die less frequently. People are injured less frequently. So why aren't we doing that? How do we do more of it? I'm really glad there's a lot more national guidance and support and momentum. Absolutely. We're not alone in thinking about this, but if you haven't seen this yet, absolutely fantastic. Came out about a month ago or so. It's the NACTO, National Association of City Transportation Officials Guide. And what you'll see is real guidance on how do we set speeds. And, we have a 25 mile per hour, as you guys know, across the city, but there's places where 20 makes more sense. And it's not just the street design, it's also the use activity level you'll see on the left there. So I encourage people to check that out. One statistic I learned that's really compelling, and maybe this will be the number two stat I hope people take away, is, and this is I want to note, the source of this is the Highway Safety Manual, so not some crazy report, but the stat is that on average, a 1 mile per hour decrease in speed, average speed, 1 mile per hour lower, can result in 17% fewer fatal crashes. Pretty huge. So we're not talking about huge numbers to make a huge difference. And I want to highlight this because I know I just ran through a bunch of, international and New York City, et cetera, et cetera. But my home state of Florida, I want to give some credit to St. Petersburg, Florida, but also to show that, hey, lots and lots of folks are thinking about this differently. This is, St. Pete doesn't actually have a Vision Zero plan, but they have a complete streets plan. And this is from kind of the opening letter in which the mayor writes. But this highlighted part I want to mention, he talks about speed being such a problem. We know that speed is a problem. And this is because that's how engineers, planners, and city leaders here and in other cities have designed roads for decades. We invite people to drive too fast. This is not meant to be a finger pointing at anyone. I know the planners and engineers on this call are not to blame and city leaders not to blame. It really is, it's a legacy. It is unfortunately, a footprint that we're all working in. And I think this is where, back to kind of the third question of Vision Zero path forward, what do we need to be doing? We need to move beyond nibbling around the edges, and we need to really shift the base of what we're doing. And I want to kind of harken back for a second here to kind of real life. This is a World Day of Remembrance event. I know Walk San Francisco and others organized, and the gentleman speaking there, you may have heard it from him. I'm sure you've heard of him, but maybe heard from him in some meetings, is Alvin Lester, who's a member of Families for Safe Streets, very active, and he lost his son in the Bayview to a traffic crash. And I just want to pause it for a second and emphasize this. This is real life we're talking about, right? And if we know, I'm just going to go back, if we know that these speeds have these effects, what can we do to help not have another parent lose their child? These are known things. Real quickly, I won't do this, but these other countries are doing it. This is not impossible. So US, far worse rate, just to mention, US traffic death rate, this is national, we're between 12 and 13 traffic deaths per 100,000 people. These other countries I'll mention, say Netherlands, UK, they're in the range of 3 to 4 traffic deaths. Hasn't always been that way, but they've come further than us. So what do? Obviously, things are not going to change, without real change, real effort. And I've been thinking recently, and I promise I'm winding down because I realize my time has gone long here. So I will wind down just by saying, I'm really encouraged by I would call it the paradigm shift we're seeing around sustainability and awareness of climate change. So if you looked back at the environmental movement, that picture on the bottom looks like, gosh, probably a 70s, maybe 60s or 70s, probably 70s folks of, people riding their bikes and saying, oh, cars are terrible, et cetera, et cetera. From that place to, well, earlier than that, Rachel Carson's book, which, folks were thinking, what in the world is this? To Al Gore talking about it and kind of mainstreaming it. What a shift we've seen in awareness of climate change and action towards climate change. Certainly not everyone, we know, and that's contentious, but what a difference. And we know that we are seeing, business leadership, government leadership, absolutely here in California. And I want to commend Governor Newsom, for talking about this so much and doing so much. So how do we, we're part of this, obviously transportation, but also show that these things can change. This is paradigm shift, right? And I mentioned this report, or I referenced this report earlier. This just came out about a week ago. The World Economic Forum was part of this, along with some other groups. It's called the Global Foresight Project on Transforming Mobility by Mid-Century. Super catchy title, but I want to draw your attention to that middle quote. And I'll harken back for a second to the Market Street Project. It's again really, well, flat out disappointing to hear that that's trying to be paused, but I think this quote really addresses that and so much work well, because we know that money is a problem. But this quote says, a recurring and dangerous distraction is that the transport transition is expensive. In absolute terms, it is expensive, but it's actually vastly cheaper than the prodigious efforts to perpetuate unsustainable mobility. So really putting that in perspective and thinking about change on a high level. We know that this is possible. You've probably read that Helsinki and Oslo, 2 cities that did go a year, 2019, without a single pedestrian death, they did big change. They made big change, both of congestion pricing, dramatic speed lowering, significant speed lowering, significant room for more walking and biking, significant strong transit, which let me say, I know is a difficult one right now, given the economy and pandemic, but to really think about how are we tying these things together, we have to. So really coming back to what does it all mean, the big picture. I'll say I'm really impressed that I know you all have a lot of this already in your plan. The action plan talks about slower speeds, talks about reducing vehicle miles traveled, talks about these things. It's really a matter about doing them now, frankly, and doing them on a really big level. We need to be shifting from the hotspot approach. That high injury network is still important, but we need to be thinking about, okay, how do we think broadly? How do we really look at being proactive and systemic? It is by lowering speeds in all the ways we can, in every way. And I would say I shouldn't say no one's doing it yet, because this shows some, but there are cities moving to 20 miles per hour. Cities such as Seattle, Portland, DC, where they're lowering, not on all the streets, but on some of the streets, the residential streets, 20 miles per hour and 25 on arterials. I'd love to plant the seed. Could San Francisco be the first to go 20 miles per hour citywide? Have to get the approval from the state, which is probably not quick, but I would say possible. And knowing that that would reduce traffic crashes and save lives. So could we be the first city that's 20 miles per hour? And then we design for it, we sign for it, we educate for it, we enforce appropriately for it. That would mean fewer deaths. And that's a political question and a policy question more than it is a technical or practical question. I won't get into this, but if folks are interested, there's a great new UN report, United Nations report on how do we get to the global goal of zero traffic deaths by 2050 internationally. Pretty big goal. But you'll see a lot of emphasis here on speed and speed management. Just winding back that I know you all have a lot of this in your plan. And again, here's a place you guys are excelling, is really connecting these areas of land use and housing, climate action, mode shift, all of it. You're connecting it really well. I think it's now about the action of it, right? It's about thinking big. That example of Twin Peaks, and I'm not suggesting Twin Peaks is the most important, spot to do this on, but it's a great example to say, okay, does pushback to change keep us from Vision Zero in the future? Hopefully that's not the case, but it's going to make a real commitment, or need a real commitment from you guys. I'd say from the board, obviously from the mayor, from the board of supervisors, and really think about being willing to make transformative paradigm shifting change. And I would say if there's ever a time for it, it probably is during this time. Post-pandemic, green recovery, safe recovery. I will wind down there. I've got my contact information, and I always like to end with this happier slide of, there can be gloom and doom, and we are talking about fatalities and injuries, but in the end, I know the goal we're all working on is for more. Vision Zero is about more birthdays, more time with loved ones, more happiness, more goodness together. So thank you for the chance to share. I apologize for going longer, but I couldn't help it. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing.
Well, thank you so much, Ms. Shahum. And I have to say, it was very poignant to point out that the reduction in the speed limit just by so much as 1 mile per hour. When you think about the fact that the entire globe is shut down to preserve lives, right? Yeah. And we have and that's much more insidious. We have no idea exactly how you can prevent. I mean, we know not being near other people, but you don't know. It's not as obvious how you might get sick or whom you might get sick from, but we know of the risks. And it seems to me, if it's ever been pointed out the imperative to take action, I think now is that time, both because we've recognized that preserving life is worth sacrificing for, if you think it's a sacrifice, but secondarily because we live in a world where we want to have access to more slow streets and open spaces that are safe. So if we can't do it now, I don't know if we ever will do it. And I think it's a really sad statement on humanity if we don't want to save a few lives, or all lives for that matter. So anyway, thank you so much for your presentation. I don't know if directors had any quick questions before we moved into our next section, which is our staff presentation. Director Eakin.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Leah, for your presentation and all of your knowledge and hard work. It's just so moving to hear it all. And my dog is also moved to comment in this matter. So I wanted to ask a couple of questions. And one is really thinking, I guess, just right now, where we are right now. Director Tumlin keeps reminding us that we are going to have to make really tough decisions on budget. And we're in an unprecedented budget challenge moment. And so I wonder, you sort of talked about the evolution of an approach on Vision Zero and how it used to be just about kind of these E's and how you want to transition us, knowing that we're going to be facing this budget challenge for some time. Does that shift at all what you recommend to us as we think about our priorities and the different types of approaches, knowing we're going to have to bring that cost effectiveness lens to everything right now?
Yeah, great question. And I just want to pause and say, you all have a really hard job. You had a hard job a year ago or 5 years ago. It got harder for all the agencies doing this important work in all the cities. Because it's harder doesn't mean we can't do it or we shouldn't do it, though. And I don't want to pretend to have, the answer to such a challenging question, but to say, okay, is this in many ways the hardest time, or is it the ideal time for change? And I think given that people have been kind of forced to make change, as Chairperson Borden was saying, in some ways, maybe it's more appropriate to be making the change now, right? And what can we be doing that is maybe not as beautiful and perfect, but maybe a little cheaper to do in some ways? Or frankly, maybe it is expensive, but it's worth putting the money in and taking some backlash that will come to the change, because it is a time of change. I think it's just much more about needing the strong actions and thinking about, okay, we can get creative on funding. I don't mean to sound overly simplistic, but cities have done this before, right? If it's important, we do it. And I want to just pause because I just saw this great article in the Guardian newspaper. And it's interesting. They talked about many cities, or some cities doing a kind of a green recovery. And a couple quotes from LA mayor. So LA is really thinking about how does it recover from this in a positive way. Mayor Garcetti says, people have felt that they own their neighborhoods again. This is during the pandemic. They feel connected to it again. People started walking in their neighborhoods, biking, roller skating, and then goes on to say that you can only have a stimulus where you champion mass transit and clean energy, not just for a strong economy, but for a more livable city where you walk more and aren't stuck in traffic. I think what we'll see after the pandemic is a city that will surprise you. You know, he's not getting the details there, but those are the questions to be asking. That's the bar to be setting. That's where to be pushing ourselves. And I understand it's not just your job. You've got to have the mayor probably and board of supervisors on board and health folks and such. But I would say you all can play a leading role in asking for that and saying, we want to do this. And frankly, giving, you know, it can't come from staff necessarily only either, right? It's got to come from the leadership. So I think y'all do have an important role to play.
Yeah, yeah. I wanted to highlight the example of the left turn fix that you made. I was off camera, but I was sort of screaming yes when you were saying this, like yes, 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 1,000 times yes, that let's not wait for Director Tumlin to tell us that the rapid response crew went out after the thing happened, but we can analyze our city and understand our city in certain similarities across intersections, across places. And so if we know something works in a few places, let's fix it ahead in hundreds of other places. And I wonder if there's an effective framework that you know from all of your other city work that we should just simply adopt here, where we can sort of create a list of those challenging types of places. We know from Ryan's presentation coming up, the top 3 causes of the fatalities here in San Francisco. Just really curious for your recommendations. How would we really do that here? Because that just seems so smart and so sensible to get ahead of the problem. And I'm not sure we're doing that at the scale that you're challenging us to do quite yet.
Yeah, I've been thinking about that a lot too. What are the other areas or possibilities for that? I don't know at the moment. My head comes back to the speed management piece again, because really what that left turn change is, it's about slowing the cars down. What they did there is not some, again, dramatic, like I said, they were doing different types of fixes depending, wildly different. Some were just paint, some were retiming, some were restricting left turns, so different things. But the goal there was where you're going to have a vehicle crossing this busy pedestrian area, they need to be going very, very, very slow. So it's not a speed limit issue. It's not a camera issue. It's not an enforcement issue. That's totally a design issue, right? So I think one way to look is, okay, what are other problematic movements or locations where there's kind of a theme, or, you know, and how do you slow those cars down? I mean, it sounds really basic, right? But we know we can slow cars down more. We have to do it. And I want to mention this because this was interesting. Seattle did something similar to what New York City did in that cross-city analysis and approach. And in their efforts to shift from a reactive to a more proactive, predictive, systemic approach, Seattle's analysis showed that 65% of their fatal and severe injuries were at locations where there were no serious injuries for the prior 10 years. And it's interesting, I don't mean to diminish the importance of a high injury network. It's fantastic, but I'll mention, this is one thing I learned from, I was able to talk to a lot of folks from Sweden about their early work. What they found is they started with a hotspot approach, like we have and every city has with that high injury network. And then they built on that. They didn't stop doing it, but then they shifted to the proactive predictive. And it's interesting, they saw Sweden, and again, it's a whole country, not just the city, but a country, at 6 years into their program of Vision Zero, they saw a plateau. They saw a plateau. And that's when they came back and said, wait a minute, we can't just be doing the hotspot approach. We need to be doing the systemic forward looking. So I honestly think San Francisco, I think New York, I think Seattle, we're at that stage. That's the next step.
Thank you. I think that's very important. Director Heminger.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Leah, how you been?
Hi, very good, Director. Nice to see you.
You know, I think I learned the 3 E's from you.
Oh, no.
And at the time, they were engineering, education, and enforcement. Today, you seem somewhat equivocal, to use another E,
Nice.
about those 3. And I couldn't tell whether you think we ought to add a couple more E's or throw a couple of E's out of the boat. Can you be more explicit about that, another E?
Yes, thank you. I will be very explicit and hopefully try to think of another E. Thank you for that question. It's interesting. I've definitely had, this is an area I feel like I've learned a lot on, and I think a lot of us are still learning, and it's, it's a learning curve. But I learned the E's program, or the idea of the E's, has been around apparently, for many, many decades. So just to be clear, this is not a Vision Zero thing. The E's were not created by Vision Zero. They've been around as long as we've all been doing this and longer. So that approach. Interestingly, the way Vision Zero was created, again, started in Sweden 20 years ago, the truest form of Vision Zero, which I would say we're mostly not doing yet in the US, and no offense, we're just not, and I'll take some of the blame for that. I think what we've done is we've brought Vision Zero in, we've put it on top of the E's, and we've done some other good things differently, but it's still on the base of the E's. And I know I've learned for 2 reasons we need to move past that. And I wouldn't say we're dissing the E's or dropping the E's. I think there's a role for all the E's, but again, the E's are not created equal. They're not some line of E's, right? They're in a hierarchy. And what we need to be shifting to is this safe systems approach, which really looks and says, okay, how do we focus upstream on the things that influence the behavior most? And I want to say, again, huge thanks to the public health crew out there, because they've helped us learn this a lot. It's really similar to public health thinking on this, right? We could go out, actually, let's pause for a second and talk about the pandemic. We could go out and say, hey, everybody, let's all, do what you need to do to stay safe. Or we could say, hey, let's wear masks and socially distance. We're not going to let you just decide and figure out what are the things you need to do. We're going to have an upstream idea for that. And to really think, okay, what are at the top there? At the top is the way we design the roads. At the top is the speeds, how they're set and how they're designed. The pieces of education and enforcement, they can help encourage that. But if we try and bring the education and enforcement in without the good road design, safe road design, and the safe speeds, these things aren't effective. And let me bring it back to an equity piece, because I think this is partly why it's getting this. You're probably reading more about the E's being, I don't want to say evil, but maybe egregious in some ways, is that when we think about those E's and just a flat line and all being equal, and then you try and kind of put enforcement on top of that, especially police-led enforcement, we're then saying, hey, let's go send police to those neighborhoods that have been built environmentally and speed-wise in a less safe way. They've been that way for decades. There's certain neighborhoods that haven't gotten their fair share of safety improvements. They haven't been as engaged, or they were, frankly, really problematic years ago via redlining and such. But these areas are built in such a way that they're not safe. Now we're going to come out and ticket people there and tell them slow down and be safe and don't jaywalk, when in reality, their environment is not safe. Their situation is not safe. So it's this idea of, how do we come in and as quickly as possible build out the system better? So it's a long way to say, Director, that, I don't think the E's need to be thrown out completely. I would call it we're evolving beyond the traditional E's to have this safe systems approach using the E's in a more appropriate way.
I just wonder, in your example, my impression is that a lot of the folks speeding through the Tenderloin, for example, are not Tenderloin residents. So I think that critique breaks down a little bit there. I understand the basic point, that if you've got an unsafe road, it's hard to make it safe without changing the road. But I wonder whether we're missing an opportunity to put enforcement in places where it needs to be, because we fear that we're going to pick on the residents there when really we're picking on the non-residents.
I think that's a great point. I think hopefully as you guys move forward with more automated camera programs, I hope you do, that's a really important consideration. I've been thinking, Sam, my gut, I don't know this, but my gut's the same as yours. I wonder about other cities though. Do you know what I mean? For cities that are maybe a little more suburban in style or such. Does that still hold true? I don't know. I think it's going to be maybe city by city, but something to really, really study and look at.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Heminger. Director Lai.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. That was a lot of information, at least for me. I'm relatively new to this board. I might have missed this, but I felt like I still don't quite understand what was the cause of the inflection of the uptake again in San Francisco for traffic fatalities. I think in your presentation you mentioned, there's a link between SUV ownership and generically federal policies, which I would think apply more broadly nationally. So I'm just wondering, what do you think is the cause basically in 2017 when the uptake started again, and why is San Francisco's inflection point later than the other 3 cities that you've cited? I think it's LA, Chicago, and I'm forgetting the third one. Thank you.
Yeah, great question. In all honesty, I don't know. I think it's $1 million question. One thing that's really tough, and I know you all think about this a lot, it's really hard to honestly separate out what was it, right? Because everything's happening at the same time. So one thing we see is, if you think of those national numbers, one trend is often that when the economy is better and people are driving more, there's more vehicle miles traveled and there's more crashes and more deaths. Also, when gas prices are low, people are driving more. So there's this bigger, broader thing that people surmise, it makes sense, do have an effect. Is that exactly what San Francisco was? I don't know. Is it when our economy was booming and there were more people? I don't know. I would say this, our uptick, and I know that map was I think it was a little misleading how it shows, our uptick was quite similar to places like LA and Chicago. I think the difference is they were at a higher number to begin with and a higher rate to begin with. So, in all honesty, San Francisco was doing better pre-Vision Zero than a lot of other US cities. I want to give us credit for that. It then is still doing better than a lot of cities, but it's still doing, dropped a little bit since. So I think I guess I would say this, back to the Vision Zero piece, because, somebody could say, oh, well, gosh, you've been doing Vision Zero for what, 5 years now, and oh, you didn't reach zero, it's not working. Or, you're not going in the right direction, it's not working. I would bring it back to, we are understandably in this, growing mode, but we haven't made, nor have the other cities really. I think New York is the leader on that. And I'd probably then say Seattle and Portland, we haven't been making yet the big paradigm shifts. And a lot of that is around managing the speeds, reducing vehicle miles traveled. And those are the big pieces that will be citywide. Those will take some time to get in place and then some time to show results. So I don't expect this to be like an overnight thing either. But I think it's really about, how are you all, really setting those high bars and then really measuring and looking at the data for what happens, even corridor by corridor, to say, okay, if we did this citywide, what would it look like? So I know it's not a very complete answer, but it's a great question. And I think we all need to, try and figure it out.
Thank you.
Director Eakin, you had another question?
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. I think, Leah, one of the things that can feel kind of overwhelming about Vision Zero is there are just so many different pieces of it, right? I mean, we talked about, and Ryan will talk about red light cameras, left turn restrictions, daylighting, protected bike lanes, speed management. I mean, there's just a whole laundry list, and it seems in our last action strategy, I think it's like 60 or more individual sub-strategies. And so I just wonder what you recommend in terms of focus and prioritization and sort of relative effectiveness of different strategies, because again, part of how we have managed our budget situation is that we have not hired for certain open positions. Some of those in Tom and Jamie's division that I'm sure they're feeling the pain of not having those extra staff on their team to do all of this incredible work. And so we just, again, probably are going to have to make hard decisions about sort of this versus that. And I took very clearly from your presentation, speed management is a key takeaway. Like, you think that is the most important thing that we should be kind of focused on. I I don't know. I just wonder, can you, like, I almost want like the pie chart of our effort. If we had to divide up our team's time, like what is more important than other things? What is there anything that we're doing that is less effective and we just shouldn't be doing it as much? I'm sure Director Tomlin would say no. We're doing only effective things to begin with. There is no fat to cut from the system. But I really wonder if you can help direct us to think about prioritization and what are the most effective things we could be focused on, and just how do we, again, think about a framework of all of these 60 plus strategies, and how do we sort of create a plan that feels that we can have confidence is going to get us to that zero, which Director McGuire reminded us at the beginning, we're not currently on that trend line to zero.
Yeah. I think at a really high level, even before we get to what strategies work and what needs to happen on the ground or policy-wise, I honestly, I can see San Francisco doing this because we are capable of this. We've led in so many areas this way, but a paradigm shift even in what you're doing and why. So back to that question of the money and, any fat to cut. I'm sure you don't have, fat to cut. Now it is lean, but that's in the MTA's budget. I bet the hospital, and obviously the hospitals are dealing a lot with COVID, but hospitals are spending less because they're not going out to as many traffic crashes. And we know because the public health has done great analysis of the millions and millions and millions our city spends on traffic crash reaction or services and all of that. I'll pause about lawsuits. There are lawsuits to the agency, much more direct related to vehicle crashes. We know, the governor set very ambitious statewide goals around environment, and the work we're doing could tie into that much more directly. Could we as a city say, you know what, we're not just nibbling on the edges and staying within MTA's budget. We're going to do these things that's also going to include public health funding and state funding for environmental, climate change goals. And everything we're doing is going to be looked at as the cross-sectoral benefits it is. Because, for many years it was, those bike and pet advocates coming and asking for this. Well, those things they were asking for are actually helping meet our governor's climate goals, helping meet our, mayor's public health safety goals, meeting your, safety and et cetera goals. How do we look at this differently? And that's a big ask, but again, at a time of change in this pandemic, I think that's the time to do it. And in terms of the strategies, it's absolutely what you said. It's about, and I say managed speeds. I know that's kind of a wonky and vanilla term. I use it a lot. Let's be honest, it's slowing speeds. So people talk about culture change a lot, right? Like, we need culture change before we can make these other changes. No, we need to make the changes. Leaders need to make the changes, which leads to culture change. If this were 30 years ago, we'd be smoking in these rooms. We'd be smoking on an airplane. We'd be smoking in your board meeting at the hospital. We'd be smoking. And I mention that because it's just such a poignant, and the very young people on the call have no idea what I'm talking about, but they'd be smoking cigarettes. And frankly, my grandparents would have had a couple drinks and gotten in the car and not given it a second thought. That's culture change too. Well, we didn't just wait till people got it. We didn't wait till people were believers. That came from leadership, sticks and carrots. And I think, we have a lot more sticks and carrots to use in this work, and we can't wait for it to be well-funded or easy. It's not going to come. It's not going to happen.
Yeah. Can I just ask a follow-up question on this? Because it just feels so important. Just given the scale of there's a citywide problem. I thought that Seattle stat was so interesting because it feels like if we are successful in reaching our mode share goal and encouraging 80% of people to walk and bike and use transit by 2030, then you're exactly right. Then people are going to be biking, walking more places than just the high injury network, and probably where those collisions are occurring is going to expand beyond the high. So it's like this incredibly challenging problem because Tom and his staff have worked so hard on the high entry network, and it feels like that problem is going to shift. It's not going to be static. And so I guess I just wonder if you talk about speed management or, slowing speeds, it seems like a lot of these engineering or even quick build approaches we're talking about are fundamentally about slowing speeds. They are about sort of managing driver behavior, ensuring safe driver behavior, whether it's protected bike lanes or left turn, mitigations. How do you compare the sort of relative effectiveness of saying, let's go because it's a citywide challenge. Let's go 20 miles an hour citywide, which might have an effect of safer streets everywhere with targeted sort of surgical, strategic changes to certain streets. I wonder, and again, there's, we talked about automated speed enforcement. That would be a citywide policy, or congestion pricing would be a citywide, or, maybe more targeted policy. Again, I just and it's like the answer I feel like is always, well, we've got to do it all, and we don't have the staff or budget to do it all. But I mean, are there, I guess I'm getting at, what is the closest thing to silver bullet here that we have to potentially go after, knowing that we just don't have the money or the resources to fix each intersection sort of one by one? If that feels like a whack-a-mole challenge and we're just behind it, we're behind it every time. Is there anything more systemically citywide that we should be considering or approaching instead?
Yeah. I think you guys have done some great work with light retiming. I didn't mention that, but that can be a measure, and I don't know how robust that is, but the signal timing there, you hit on it, right? Is it this or is it this? Of course, it's all of it, and that's the hard thing to hear. I think one thing I get worried about, I do it myself, thinking about strategy of it would be best to have automated speed enforcement allowed before we lower the speed limits, before we redesign the streets, say for 20 miles per hour. Let's get automated speed enforcement approved and in first. Sure, that would be best, but maybe that's not the most practical and timely way to go. And I think this idea of there is a logic to it, I admit, but maybe there's a way we lower speed limits and redesign some major streets that are problematic, and then bring in the ASE, automated speed enforcement, after, if that's kind of the timing of it. I guess not waiting for the perfect, for the enemy of the good kind of thing. And let me say, this is not easy stuff. The questions you're asking, that you guys are all asking, is what other cities in the US are asking. I think they've gotten a lot of it figured out. And again, not just European, but Bogota and Mexico City, they're not perfect, but they have extensive speed camera programs. They are lowering speed limits significantly. They're doing a lot of car-free spaces in the areas where you would really, really, really want a lot of walking and biking, et cetera. And it's a problematic thing. They're doing all those things. I know it's easier politically there. It just is. I don't want to diminish how hard it is for them either, but we are challenged by, norms here that push back against that change. Our individual freedoms of driving and such. I think, Director Borden said it really well of, hey, thinking about the pandemic and safety and the good of the whole. That's really what we're talking about here. I have no doubt that the amazing staff of MTA knows how to do the things. I mean, the tools are pretty well known, not 100%, but well known. It's really about what is the city going to accept and demand, and who's asking for it, and how are they asking for it? Again, I think this is more of a political challenge than it is a technical challenge of how. Yeah.
No, I think that's right. I think I know Director Brinkman has a question, and then we're going to get to the staff presentation. But one of the things I hope that staff can address is, if we know there are two simple interventions we've talked about: reduction in speed limits and the limitations of left-hand turns, right? So how much cost is that to the agency? I know there's the environmental exemption, and I don't know if there's some laws that need to be changed in some instances, but let's cost out, maybe if we have a sense of, if you did it blanketly, it would cost, is it an incremental cost, or is it per intersection to do something? Does it cost this amount? I think that would be helpful if there's a way to talk about that, because there's a bunch of different staff time and research and outreach that's involved in those decisions that we can cost out and talk about. And so maybe staff can address that in their presentation. But before we get to that, I'll let Director Brinkman ask her question.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair Borden. Leah, thank you for the presentation. It's always so good to be re-energized and to have our resolve brought back up on this issue. It's such an important issue. And I'll echo what you said, staff to Shahum's department, they know what to do. This is so much more a political problem than it is a physical problem. We know automated speed enforcement is not coming quickly to us. That's not an easy fix. That's out of the city's hand. But I would like to ask, I always have found the idea of how much money other departments in the city save when we can bring traffic injuries and fatalities and just simple fender benders down, because fender benders have a cost too, even if nobody is injured. And do you have knowledge of any other city that has managed to kind of reprioritize that funding and keep track of the money that they've saved as they've made traffic safety changes and then been able to sort of harness some of that money to use towards traffic safety changes?
Yeah, great question. I'm not aware of any. I think it's a brilliant opportunity, a great opportunity, but I'm not seeing it yet. And just to think, I mean, it could be an opportunity where, gosh, is that analysis even estimated, done? Could that be something shared regularly, even just internally, or, at the board meetings? Maybe other agencies eventually, buy in and pick it up. But, even if it didn't change things immediately, to be raising awareness around that, putting out the costs. What is the cost of not making the safety change and publicizing it?
Yeah, maybe that's something insurance companies would like to sponsor.
Yeah, good idea.
Well, with that, we'll turn it over. I know staff has a presentation and we'll have more discussion along the way. So I'm going to turn it over to Ryan on staff to get us started.